Chapter 1 The Fountain. Sara curled her legs up so her feet could stay warm beneath the small blanket. Her bed creaked as she turned. Her eyes searched the room. The other girls rested in their beds. Some of them tossed and turned in an effort to get warm. Sara waited and listened to the rain outside. Drops hit her window in a steady rhythm. The rain reminded her of fear, smoke, tears, and that singular night. She tried to overcome the rain's hypnotic power, but her eyes were drooping, and her mind was pulling her away. The room filled with smoke, and the water in Sara's eyes blurred her vision. Her mother lifted her. Glass shattered as her father smashed the back window with his elbow. Her mother helped her out the window, just large enough for 4-year-old Sara to fit through. She told Sara to run. Crying and shaking, Sara ran from the house. She hid in the overgrowth near the forest and watched as the smoke became heavier and the fire surrounded the little cottage. Rain fell. Thunder woke Sara. She sat up and pulled her blanket to her chin. Lightning flashed, brightening the room. Her eyes searched the space to find the other girls asleep. The thunder had not awoken them, and their tossing had ceased. Sara tried to get out of bed as quietly as she could, but the bed squealed as she stepped down. She poked her head under the bed and retrieved a kettle full of water. She sat on the floor and pulled the kettle toward her. Her eyes focused on the water. "Please, please, please," she whispered. Lightning flashed again, and for a moment her face was reflected in the water. She never saw herself properly before. The orphanage had no mirrors. She wondered if she had grown to look like her mother. She was 14, yet shorter than other girls her age. Her mother was tall and slender, her movements fluid, like the power she possessed. She concentrated on the water. Come on, come on. But the water didn't move. It didn't ripple. Sara closed her eyes. Her mother's eyes were hazel, and her hair was light brown. Her voice was even and soft. Her father's eyes were green, and his smile made her feel at ease. She drew their faces in her mind's eye. She struggled to remember who they were, but being so young, she remembered only warm embraces, gentle words, sometimes harsh words, but more so the gentle ones. Opening her eyes, she turned her attention back to the water. She glanced toward the window as lightning lit the glass. Drop. Splash. Water seeped over the edge of the kettle as ripples drifted from the center. Sara focused more closely, hoping to send the water spilling again. But as she focused, a drop of water landed into the pot, causing the water to ripple and spill over the edge. She looked up. Another drop of water dislodged from the ceiling and dropped into the pot. Sara sighed. She pushed the kettle back under the bed. She got her blanket and used it to mop up the water that had spilled. It was no use. The water continued to leak from the ceiling. The old pot could catch the drops, she thought. But that would only make the water in the kettle splash, causing more of a mess. She would go without dinner if Miss Fiora discovered she took the kettle from the kitchen. She crawled back into bed, carrying the wet blanket with her. She spread the blanket over the end of the bed to allow it to dry. Reaching under the mattress, she retrieved the necklace. The necklace had a blue gemstone in the shape of a raindrop hanging from a delicate woven cord. She clenched the gemstone in her fist and, colder than before, she tried to go back to sleep. Blankets rustled against sheets as Sara awoke. The other girls were making their beds. She got up quickly to make her own. Taking the damp blanket from one end of the bed, she placed it over the sheets and smoothed out the dank wrinkles. As she bent over the bed, patting down the blanket, she caught the faint scent of rain. Years ago, she overheard her father and mother as they talked in their dining room. Peering from behind the paneled wall, Sara watched her parents. Her mother sat at the small dinner table, and her father stood across from her. He rubbed his forehead. "I should go with you," she said. "I can reason with him." "No. Sara needs you, and I have to protect both of you. He won't stop until he's killed us all." Her mother knitted her brow. "I don't understand." No one can understand the mind of a madman. Sara? Sara was leaning over the bed. She turned her head. Miranda raked through her long hair with an old comb. The teeth of the comb were missing in places. It's time to eat. You're not getting sick, are you? No, I was thinking. About what? Sara sighed as she smoothed down the hem of her blanket and turned to take her dress out of the small drawer beside her bed. My mother. I don't want to forget her face. I don't remember my mother's face, Miranda said, but she had long hair. I used to brush it for her and curl up in it at night. This was her comb. She held it up for Sara to see. Miranda was 12 years old, but she was tall and thin. She combed her hair every day, and she flinched when any of the other girls offered to braid it for her. The girls had their chores. The older girls helped in the kitchen and laundered the clothes and sheets, while the younger girls cleaned the floors and washed the dishes. In addition to scrubbing floors, Sara walked to the market every 3 days. She used to go alone, but thoughts brought her to her parents, their powers, and the question of why she lacked their gifts. She asked Miss Fiora if Miranda could accompany her on the long walks into town. The market lay in the center of town. Buildings sprawled around the market square. The School of Elements sat on a hill above the buildings. Its ivy-covered stone walls stood stark against the pale sky. Element was where elementals went to train. Elementals could manipulate and call the elements. Sara hoped to be an elemental and to harness the power her parents had. To block the sun, woven cloths covered the tops of the stands in the square. Various smells accosted market-goers, but the most prominent was the odor of dust and feathers. Elementals stood between stands and performed tricks. A huge crowd surrounded the wind elementals, who played with the autumn leaves, making them swirl and dance. A fire elemental sent rings of flame into the air. He was middle-aged, and had a scar going from under his ear, along his jaw, and down his neck. People made wide circles around him, giving him narrow-eyed glances as they passed. Sara noticed him before, when she went to the market. In that mysterious way that people can feel the eyes of others on them, Sara felt his eyes bore into her back when she turned away from him. She bit her lip. Sara, there he is again, Miranda said. Do you think he works for Hephaestus? I don't know. Sara peered at him from over her shoulder. He sure looks scary enough. Sara turned away from the fire elemental. At one of the stands, the merchant sold paper and charcoal. Sara jingled the money in her dress pocket as she stared at the paper. She forced her eyes away from the paper merchant and walked to the stand that sold eggs and chickens. The chickens were frantic in their cages, causing loose feathers to fly into the air as they moved. The clucking of the distraught chickens fighting in vain to be free of their cages made this stand the loudest in the marketplace. The merchant smiled as Sara approached. He was a calm man among chaos, with a pleasant smile on his face as the feathers of the chickens rested on his shoulders. Sara tried not to look at the struggling chickens. Have a dozen eggs, please. She held out the money. She memorized how many sparklings she needed. Aren't you one of the little girls from Ocean's Light? Half a dozen doesn't seem like enough to feed all of you. Miss Fiora likes her eggs in the morning. Sara's eyes drifted to the paper and charcoal. So you're always staring at that paper, he said with a wink. I'm saving up for it. I didn't know you were given an allowance. Sara looked away. The merchant handed her the eggs. She placed them one by one in the basket and covered them with a woolen cloth. Sara was careful not to let the eggs break. The girls whispered a story about a girl who used to live in the home. She tripped on the way from the market. The eggs cracked on the cobblestone path. After Miss Fiora was done with her, the girl ran away from the orphanage and never returned. On the road back, Sara took one coin from her pocket, knelt, and slipped the coin into her shoe. Miranda combed her hair and hummed to herself as she skipped along the path. She stopped and turned around. Aren't you always the one who says Miss Fiora will be mad if we're late? Her hands were on her hips. I thought something got into my shoe. Sara stood. Just shake it out. It's fine now. You're right. Let's go. When Sara and Miranda returned, Mari, one of the older girls, was crying on the steps in front of the house. Rosalind, the nurse, comforted her. You'll see your father again. He's waiting among the ethers in the heavens. Sara and Miranda bowed their heads and climbed the steps to the door. Sara looked back at Mari before she stepped inside. Miss Fiora stood in her office, gazing upon the decorative box that rested upon the mantel. The girls believed Miss Fiora kept the ashes of her late husband in that box. Sara handed the money in her pocket to Miss Fiora. Miss Fiora stood tall, her shoulders back, and eyes at a constant downward tilt. Her dress was freshly ironed, the white collar pressed firmly down. Sara's skin tingled as Miss Fiora counted the coins. Prices are still up, I see. While the other girls did their chores, Sara returned to the bedroom. She took the coin from her shoe and opened her drawer. Inside, under an old handkerchief, was another coin. She placed the second coin under the handkerchief and closed the drawer. Weeks ago, she returned with fewer loaves of bread, telling Miss Fiora that she didn't have enough money for the extra loaves. The next time Sara went to the market, Miss Fiora had given her extra sparklings for the bread. She could have taken all the extra coins, but decided that would be too risky. That night, the wind beat against the window above Sara's bed. She thought of Mari, who lost her father. She wondered what had happened to him, if he died like her parents. She waited with her hands up to her chin, clenching the raindrop necklace, until she heard the gentle snoring of the other girls and felt confident they were asleep. She slinked down to the floor, placed the necklace under the mattress, and pulled the kettle of water from beneath the bed. She stared into the water until her eyes hurt and clouds covered the dim light of the moon. Too dark to see, Sara replaced the kettle and climbed back into bed. She retrieved the necklace and, holding it, went to sleep. Her mother woke her in the dead of the night. Her face was pink. Beads of sweat patterned her forehead. A strange and surprisingly loud sound came from outside, a crackling that roared. The fire surrounded the house on all sides. Her father tried desperately to put out the flames that filled the cottage. He drenched the flames with water flowing from his fingertips, but they would not go out. "We have to get her out," her father shouted. Her mother ran, carrying Sara to the back of the cottage. Her father broke a small window. Her mother ripped the necklace with the teardrop gem from her neck and gave it to Sara. "Always keep it close, my love." Her father extinguished the flames from outside. "Hurry," he said. "I don't know how long I can hold them back." Her mother placed her through the broken window. "Run, baby, and don't look back." Sara ran. She tripped. She glanced toward the house. She expected her parents to climb through after her, but flames rose in front of the window. Warm tears rushed from her eyes, aided by grief and smoke. A laugh resounded in the distance, and the fire rose from the cottage as the tears blurred Sara's vision. She did as her mother said, and hid behind a wild shrub not far from her home. The smoke rose and twisted in the night air. A cold, stiff rain fell, putting out the fire, but it was too late. The smoke smothered Sara's parents before the fire ever reached them. Strong hands lifted her from among the leaves. Mari was absent from breakfast the next morning. Sara stared into her bowl as Miranda talked and combed her hair. After breakfast, Sara carted the tray of bowls and dishes to the kitchen. She rolled up the sleeves of her dress and dipped the first plate into the basin of water. Taking the bar of hard soap, she rubbed it between the palms of her hands. The soap would not lather. She stopped and put down the soap. Faint sobs came from the back of the kitchen. She dried her hands on a worn old dish rag and walked in the direction of the sobbing. Behind the large pots and sacks of potatoes on the floor was Mari. Sara knelt, took the handkerchief from her dress pocket, and gave it to Mari. Mari looked up. Her sobs quieted. Embarrassment overcame her sadness for a moment. She took the cloth from Sara and wiped the tears off her cheeks. "Thank you." Sara got up to return to the dishes. "Wait. Stay with me for a little while." Sara knelt beside Mari. "Did you want some breakfast?" Sara asked. "I think there's still some porridge left over." Mari shook her head. Her hand gripped the worn cloth. Silence hung in the air for some time. Sara struggled for words as if the silence would destroy them both if she didn't find any. "What happened to your father?" Mari glared at her. Sara looked down at her hands. "My father," Mari started. Her voice was softer than her glare. "My father died." More tears leaked from her eyes. "He was a soldier for the resistance. Hephaestus's men killed them. I got the letter yesterday." Sara was aware that Hephaestus was the fire elemental everyone in Mirmina feared, but she knew very little of what he had done. Her parents had sheltered her from it. The messenger gave me this. Mari held up a silver band for Sara to see. The band was large enough to be worn around the arm. When he was alive, my father wore this as a symbol of his allegiance to the resistance and to the protection of Mirmina. She balled up the material and threw the silver band across the room. Was your father an elemental? No, she sobbed. He was just a man, but Hephaestus killed him like a beast. Sara fought for something to say. My parents died too. I was with them when it happened, but I don't remember much. I dream about it sometimes, but I forget the details in the morning. Tears dripped into Mari's hands. Sara touched her arm. I'm sorry. No one can say anything to make you feel right again. I just wanted you to know you aren't alone. Everyone here lost somebody. Mari stabbed her with her eyes. My grief is cheap. That's what you're saying? Sara shook her head. She stood. I don't know what I'm saying. Please forgive me. Sara left the kitchen. She might get into trouble for leaving the dishes unwashed, but she failed to soothe Mari. What was I thinking? Telling her grief was on an assembly line? A crash came from the kitchen. Sara ran back inside. A basket lay on its side. Cracked shells and egg guts littered the floor. What happened here? Miss Fiora stormed into the room. She looked to Mari. Mari's lips trembled. It was me, Sara blurted out. I broke the eggs. Miss Fiora grabbed her arm. What happened, girl? I slipped. Backed into the shelf. The basket fell. I tried to catch it, but you know what eggs cost. Miss Fiora pulled Sara out of the kitchen and dragged her to the anteroom where the girls read and played jacks and dice. The girls stopped their activities and looked up at Sara and Miss Fiora. Miss Fiora left the room. Sara, what? Miranda stopped and sank back into the crowd. Miss Fiora returned with the switch. Palms up. Sara slowly offered her hands. Miss Fiora snapped the switch across her palms. The pain stung and left heat. Miss Fiora continued to strike her hands. Sara's palms burned and itched, but she held her hands out. Mari ran into the room. Sara thought she would speak up and tell Miss Fiora that what Sara told her was a lie. Mari was the one who broke the eggs. Don't say anything, Sara thought. Miss Fiora will finish with me, but if you say anything, she'll snap your palms and give me double for lying. But Mari bit her tongue. Her eyes never left Sara's reddened palms until the punishment was done. Miss Fiora snapped the switch one last biting time and moved away from Sara. Sara tried rubbing her raw, itchy palms, but they stung worse. She left the anteroom and sat on her bed. Minutes later, Rosalind walked into the room. Let me see. She rubbed a gel on Sara's palms. The itching and burning dissipated. There, Rosalind said. It's not so bad. I've seen worse. This should heal by morning. Rosalind patted Sara's arm. Mari entered the room as Rosalind left. Her eyes were on the floor. You didn't have to do that for me, you know, Mari said. Why did you smash the eggs? Sara asked. I was angry, Mari said. You were right. All the girls here have lost someone. My father, he didn't have to join the resistance. He should have stayed with me. And now he's dead. Sara looked at her hands. Why did you lie for me? Sara bit her lip. She was part of the reason Miss Fiora was so upset about the eggs. Money was tight. Sara was stealing it. I felt bad about what I said. You have just as much right as anyone to grieve your father. There shouldn't be a contest for who's in the most pain. 3 days later, Sara and Miranda made the trip to the market. This time, Sara had put the 2 coins into her shoe. They slid back and forth as she walked. What was your mother like? Miranda asked as they walked to the market. Sara walked with her head down. I don't remember much. She was beautiful. She cared for me. She had powers like my father. They were elementals. How come you aren't an elemental? I don't know. Miranda took the comb out of her pocket. She stopped walking. Sara stopped too and looked back at her. Miranda was looking down at the comb. This wasn't my mother's. When I was 5 years old, one of the older girls gave it to me before she left. I don't remember my mother. She left me outside of the chapel in Calina when I was born. Miranda cried, and Sara rubbed her arm. She wiped her tears with the back of her hands. Sara offered to hold the basket, and Miranda gave it to her. Once in the market, Miranda's tears had dried. Sara suggested they split up to make fast work of their task and impress Miss Fiora. She gave the basket to Miranda and told her to get the bread, while she would get the potatoes and beans. She handed Miranda coins for the bread and hurried off to the stand that sold paper. She stopped in front of the stand. She looked at her palms. Miss Fiora's punishment had faded, but Sara remembered the sting. She looked back at the paper and charcoal. She swallowed her fear and approached the stand. I want 3 sheets of paper and a stick of charcoal, please, she told the vendor. That'll be 3 sparklings. Sara took off her shoe and dumped the 2 coins into her palm. She retrieved one from her pocket. As she felt for the coin in her pocket, her fingers grazed the smooth surface of the teardrop gem of her mother's necklace. The vendor grinned. He looked down at the coins in her hand. You live in the orphanage, don't you? Sara nodded. Those aren't your coins. Sara pressed her lips together and shook her downturned head. You shouldn't steal, not even from a bitter old woman. Without taking her coins, the vendor offered her a few sheets of paper and a stick of charcoal. Sara looked at it tentatively. Go on. Take it, he said. When everyone in Mirmina wants your drawings, you can sign one for me. Thank you, sir. Sara regrettably folded the sheets twice so they would fit into her pocket. She hurried to buy the potatoes and beans and met Miranda at the fountain. She put the small sack of potatoes and the jar of beans in a basket at Miranda's feet. Miranda was mesmerized by the dancing of the wind elementals who were making leaves and ribbons twirl in the breeze around them as they danced. I wonder what it would be like to be an elemental. The fire elemental with the scar was watching them from a distance. It's time to leave, Sara said. Wait, I have an idea. Miranda took off her shoes and got up on the ledge of the fountain. What are you doing? Take off your shoes. Miranda reached down to give Sara a hand. Come on, it'll be fun. Sara sighed, but she took off her shoes and took Miranda's hand. Once they both stood on the fountain's ledge, Miranda twirled and danced like the wind elementals in the square. Sara looked down into the clear water of the fountain. Closing her eyes, she remembered the face of her mother. She danced, imagining that she could call water to swirl around her. She moved her feet along the warm, gritty stone of the fountain's ledge. She felt a cool, light feeling on the undersides of her feet. The market became very quiet. Sara opened her eyes. The eyes of everyone in the market were on her. Miranda had gotten down from the fountain's ledge, and she too was staring at Sara. Sara's feet no longer touched the grainy stone of the ledge. Beneath her feet, the water glistened in the sun.